My wife betrayed me with her colleague, who manipulated her, but he was punished, lost the court case, and lost everything. But then, it was a warm autumn evening when I pulled into the driveway of our modest suburban home. The street was quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. I sat in the car for a moment longer than usual, the soft glow of the dashboard lights reflecting on my tired face. Life had been good, I thought, as I watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting a golden hue across the sky. Business had been booming. Our boys were thriving at college, and Julie and I had just celebrated our 18th wedding anniversary with a weekend getaway to the coast. We were supposed to be happy, but as I stared at the house where we had built our lives together, a knot of unease settled in my stomach. Lately, something had felt off between Julie and me, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. There were moments, small, fleeting moments, where I'd catch her gazing out the window, lost in thought, her smile fading as if she was somewhere far away. I brushed it off as emptiness syndrome, or maybe just stress from her job in real estate. We had always been rock solid. We were a team. We were us. I killed the engine, grabbed my briefcase, and made my way inside. The familiar smell of roast chicken filled the air, a welcome reminder of home. Julie was in the kitchen, her back to me as she stirred a pot on the stove. She didn't turn when I came in. "Hey, babe," I said, dropping my keys on the counter. "Smells great in here. How was your day?" She hesitated, just for a second, before turning to face me with a strained smile. "It was fine, Tom. How about yours?" Same old," I replied, trying to shake off the strange tension. "Got a few contracts signed today. Pretty productive." She nodded, but there was something in her eyes that didn't match her smile. Something distant. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the usual end-of-day fatigue. After dinner, we settled into our usual routine. Me catching up on emails in the study, and Julie watching TV in the living room. But even through the walls, I could sense her unease. It was like a silent weight between us, something unspoken but undeniably present. It wasn't until the next morning, over coffee, that she finally said the words that would change everything. "Tom, we need to talk." I looked up from my newspaper, surprised by the serious tone in her voice. She never started conversations like that. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She took a deep breath, her fingers nervously twisting the gold bracelet on her wrist, a gift I'd given her on our 10th anniversary. "I've been thinking about us, about our marriage." My heart skipped a beat. I set the newspaper down, focusing all my attention on her. "What do you mean?" I don't know how to say this." She bit her lip, her eyes avoiding mine. "I'm not happy, Tom. I haven't been for a while." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I couldn't speak. "Not happy? Julie, what are you talking about? I thought we were doing fine." She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I thought so too, but ever since the boys left for college, I felt empty. I felt like I'm not living my own life anymore. Like I'm just going through the motions." I reached across the table, taking her hand in mine. "Why didn't you say anything? We can fix this. Whatever it is, we can work through it." She pulled her hand away, her voice trembling. "That's the thing, Tom. I don't know if we can. I don't know if I want to." The words hung in the air between us, suffocating. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what she was saying. This was Julie, my wife, my partner, the mother of my children. How could she be unhappy? How could she be questioning everything we had built together? Then she dropped the bombshell. "I've been talking to someone, a coworker. His name is Brian. He's been helping me sort through my feelings." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Brian? Who the hell is Brian?" "He works in accounting. We've been friends for a while, and he's been there for me when I've been struggling. But it's more than that, Tom. I think I need to figure out how I feel about him." I stared at her in disbelief. My mind was reeling. "You're telling me you have feelings for another man? After 18 years of marriage, you're just going to throw it all away for some guy at work?" "No, it's not like that," she said quickly, her voice pleading. "I'm not saying I'm leaving you. I need to figure things out. I need to see if this is something real, or if it's just me being confused. I stood up, pushing my chair back with more force than I intended. You need to figure it out? You want to go on a date with this guy? She flinched at the word date, but didn't deny it. Just one night, Tom. I need to know what this is before I can move forward with us. I owe it to myself. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My wife, the woman I had loved for nearly 2 decades, was asking me to let her go on a date with another man. I felt a wave of anger and hurt rise up in my chest. Julie, this isn't how marriage works. You don't just take a break to see if the grass is greener on the other side. We've built a life together. We've raised kids together. And now you want to throw it all away for some guy from accounting? I'm not throwing anything away, she cried, tears spilling down her cheeks. I just need to do this for me. I need to figure out who I am and if we're still right for each other. I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. So, what? You're going out with him tomorrow? You're really going to do this? She nodded, wiping her eyes. Yes, tomorrow night. But I promise you, nothing physical is going to happen. I just need to know where my heart is. I couldn't take it anymore. The anger, the confusion, the betrayal. It was too much. Without saying another word, I walked out of the kitchen, grabbed my keys, and left the house. I needed air. I needed to get away from her, from this nightmare. I drove aimlessly for hours, my mind racing. How had things gotten this bad? How had I missed the signs? Julie had always been my rock, my partner in everything. I thought we were happy. I thought our love was unbreakable. But now, everything was falling apart. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of a hotel on the edge of town, it was nearly dark. I booked a room, not caring about the price. I just needed to be alone, to think. As I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, my phone buzzed with a text from Julie. I'm sorry, Tom. I love you. I just need this time to figure things out. Please understand. I threw the phone across the room in frustration. Understand? How could I understand? How could I ever forgive her for what she was about to do? The next morning, I made the decision. I wasn't going to sit around and wait for her to break my heart. If she wanted to explore her feelings with Brian, fine. But I wasn't going to be a passive observer. I was going to fight back. I called my brother, David, a detective in Tampa, and explained the situation. Tom, you don't have to put up with this, David said, his voice calm but firm. Let me get you in touch with someone who can help. A private investigator. You need to know what's really going on. I agreed, and within an hour, David had connected me with Steve Wilson, a seasoned PI with a reputation for getting results. I gave Steve all the details, Julie's work schedule, Brian's name, and the time she planned to leave for their date. He promised to follow them and gather all the evidence I needed. Meanwhile, I started making my own plans. If Julie was going to entertain the idea of another man, then I wasn't going to sit idly by. I reached out to an old friend, Mark, who had gone through a messy divorce and now spent his nights with escorts. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed a way to cope. Mark gave me the number of an escort service he used, and I quickly made arrangements for an evening with a woman named Vanessa. It wasn't about revenge, at least, that's what I told myself. I just needed to feel like I had some control over the situation. By the time Julie left the house that evening, I was already at the hotel, preparing for what felt like a turning point in our marriage. Steve was parked outside our house, watching her every move, and I knew that by morning, I would have the answers I needed. The next morning, I awoke early, my head throbbing from the restless night before. The hotel room felt cold and unfamiliar, the sterile walls offering no comfort as I lay there, thinking about what Julie might be doing with Brian. I knew I had crossed a line the night before by hiring Vanessa, but in that moment of raw betrayal, it felt like the only way to take back control. I told myself it didn't mean anything, but deep down, I couldn't shake the guilt. What was happening to me? To us? I grabbed my phone and saw a text from Steve, the private investigator. He had followed Julie and Brian the entire evening and had a full report waiting for me. My heart pounded as I opened the message. Tom, it's Steve. I've got everything you need. They had dinner at a place called Le Grand on East 6th. They were close, talked for hours, but nothing physical happened while they were at the restaurant. After dinner, they went for a walk, and that's where things got interesting. He kissed her, Tom. Twice. She didn't pull away. They didn't go anywhere else after that. She went back home alone at 11:30. Let me know if you want more details. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I read the message. Even though I had expected it, seeing the truth in black and white hit me harder than I thought it would. Julie had kissed him. She hadn't stopped it. She let it happen. And after everything she had promised, after swearing it was just dinner, that nothing would happen, she had lied. I threw the phone onto the bed, my hands trembling with rage. The betrayal was real now. It wasn't just something she was thinking about. It had happened. I stood up, pacing the room, my mind spinning in 1,000 different directions. What was I supposed to do now? Could we ever come back from this? I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but something inside me stopped me. Instead, I took a shower, dressed, and made my way to the hotel lobby. As I sipped on the bitter coffee in the corner of the breakfast area, I realized I needed to think clearly. This wasn't just about my anger anymore. This was about our future, our family. How could I confront her in a way that would make her see what she had done? I had to stay calm. I decided to call Steve to get more details. "Steve," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "tell me everything." He was quick to respond. "Tom, I know this is tough to hear, but she didn't seem conflicted. It looked like she had feelings for him. They were laughing, touching hands, like they were on a date. After the walk, they kissed. It wasn't just a peck. She didn't stop it either, which tells me she wanted it. When she went home, he didn't go with her, though. That's something. That's something?" I scoffed. "She kissed another man. That's not nothing, Steve." "I get it," Steve said, his tone softening. "I'm just saying, at least she didn't take it further. There's still a chance to fix this if you want to." "Yeah," I muttered. "I'll figure it out." I hung up and sat there for a while, staring into space. I couldn't shake the image of Julie with Brian, laughing, touching, and kissing like we used to. It felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. Eventually, I drove back home. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels oppressive. I found Julie sitting at the kitchen table, sipping her tea. She looked up when I walked in, and for a moment, our eyes met. Her face was pale, her expression strained. She knew. She knew I knew. "Tom," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry." I didn't answer her right away. I walked over to the counter, poured myself a glass of water, and took a long drink. The tension in the air was unbearable, like the moment before a storm hits. "I know everything, Julie," I finally said, my voice cold. "I know about the dinner. I know about the kiss." She looked down at her hands, guilt washing over her face. "It was a mistake. I shouldn't have." "Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't tell me it was a mistake. You knew exactly what you were doing." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel sorry for her. Not anymore. "I told you," she said, her voice trembling. "I told you I needed to figure things out. I'm so confused, Tom. I never meant to hurt you." "You didn't mean to hurt me?" I said, laughing bitterly. "Do you think that makes it better? You kissed another man, Julie. You betrayed me." "I know," she whispered, her tears falling freely now. "I know, and I'm so sorry. It didn't mean anything. I don't even know why I did it." "You don't know why?" I shot back, my anger rising. "You did it because you wanted to. Because you thought maybe he was better than me." "That's not true," she cried. "It's not about him being better than you. It's just, I've been feeling so lost, and he was there. He listened to me when I needed someone, and I wasn't there for you?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger. "It's not like that," she said, wiping her tears away. "You've always been there for me, Tom. But something changed. I don't know when, but it did, and I don't know how to fix it." For a moment, we were both silent. The weight of her words hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. I didn't know how to fix it either. I didn't know if I even wanted to. "What do you want, Julie?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you want to be with him?" She shook her head furiously. No, I don't. I want to be with you. I just need time to figure out how to make things right." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "Time? What does that even mean?" Are you saying we should just pretend this never happened? No, she said quickly. I'm saying we need to work on us. I need to figure out what's wrong with me, and we need to figure out how to fix our marriage. I stared at her, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to tell her that there was no fixing this, that she had broken something that couldn't be repaired. But another part of me, the part that still loved her, wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back. I don't know, Julie, I said, my voice softening. I don't know if we can. She reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. Please, Tom, don't give up on us. I know I've hurt you, but I love you. I've always loved you. I looked down at her hand, her fingers trembling as they held mine. For a moment, I let myself believe her. But then the images of her with Brian flashed in my mind, and the anger surged back. I don't know if love is enough anymore, I said, pulling my hand away. You kissed another man. You crossed a line that I don't know if I can forgive. She nodded, her face crumpling in defeat. I understand, but please, give me a chance to prove to you that I'm committed to us. I'll do whatever it takes. I stood up, pushing the chair back. I need some time to think, Julie. I need to figure out if I can even look at you the same way again. With that, I walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her guilt. I didn't know where we would go from here, but I knew things would never be the same. How could they? Trust, once broken, was impossible to rebuild. And while part of me wanted to believe that we could fix this, another part of me knew that the damage had already been done. I spent the rest of the day driving around, trying to clear my head. But no matter where I went, no matter how far I drove, the anger and betrayal followed me like a shadow. I thought about calling David again, asking for advice, but I knew what he would say. He'd tell me to leave her, to walk away before she hurt me again. But it wasn't that simple. 18 years of marriage, 2 kids, a lifetime of memories. It wasn't something I could just walk away from. As much as I wanted to, I couldn't picture my life without her. Not yet, anyway. When I finally returned home that evening, the house was dark and quiet. Julie was sitting on the couch, waiting for me. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red from crying. I'll sleep in the guest room tonight, she said softly, standing up and walking toward the hallway. I don't want to make things harder for you. I didn't say anything as she disappeared down the hall. I just stood there, staring at the empty space where she had been, feeling the weight of her absence in the room. And for the first time since all of this began, I wondered if I had already lost her. The days that followed were a blur of tension and silence. Julie and I moved around the house like strangers, carefully avoiding each other, speaking only when necessary. At night, she stayed in the guest room, and I remained in the master bedroom. The space between us felt like a vast, unbridgeable chasm. Even though we were living under the same roof, it felt as though we were worlds apart. I spent most of my time at work, throwing myself into projects and meetings, anything to avoid coming home. The office became my refuge, a place where I didn't have to face the reality of my broken marriage. My employees, sensing something was wrong, kept their distance, and I was grateful for it. The last thing I wanted was to explain the mess my life had become. One afternoon, about a week after everything had come to light, I received an unexpected call from Steve, the private investigator. Tom, I've got something you might want to hear, he said, his tone serious. What is it? I asked, feeling my stomach tighten. It's about Brian. I've been doing some digging, and it turns out, your wife isn't the only woman he's been involved with at the office. There's another woman, a coworker. Her name's Lauren. She works in marketing. They've been seeing each other off and on for about 6 months. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what Steve was telling me. Wait, are you saying Julie wasn't the first? That's exactly what I'm saying, Steve confirmed. Brian has a bit of a reputation, apparently. He's been involved with multiple women at the office, all while keeping up appearances as the friendly, supportive colleague. He's good at playing the nice guy, but behind the scenes, it's a different story. The news hit me like a punch to the gut. I had spent so much time agonizing over Julie's betrayal, over the kiss she shared with Brian, and now I was learning that he had been playing her all along. The realization made my blood boil. Julie had fallen for his act, but it was all just part of his game. Thanks, Steve, I said, my voice tight with anger. I appreciate you finding this out. Anytime, Tom. Let me know if you need anything else, he replied before hanging up. I sat there for a few moments, staring at my phone, feeling a mixture of anger and disgust. Brian had been playing my wife, and she had fallen for it. She had risked everything, our marriage, our family, for a man who didn't care about her, a man who had probably already moved on to his next target. It made my decision clearer, but it didn't make the pain any less. That evening, when I got home, Julie was in the kitchen, quietly preparing dinner. She glanced up when I walked in, her face pale and drawn. It was clear she hadn't been sleeping well, and the weight of what had happened was etched into her features. I didn't say anything at first. I wasn't sure how to bring up what I had learned about Brian. Part of me wanted to throw it in her face, to make her realize how foolish she had been. But another part of me didn't want to kick her while she was already down. Despite everything, I still cared about her. I still loved her. As I sat down at the table, she hesitated before speaking. Tom, I've been thinking, maybe we should try counseling. I know I've hurt you, and I know I've made mistakes, but I don't want to give up on us. I looked at her, searching her face for any hint of the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. Julie, do you even understand what you've done? You risked our entire marriage for a man who didn't care about you. Do you know how many women he's been involved with at your office? Her eyes widened in shock, and she paled visibly. What are you talking about? I'm talking about Brian, I said, my voice cold. He's been seeing another woman in your office for months. Lauren. Marketing. Does that ring any bells? Julie's mouth fell open in disbelief, her eyes filling with tears. No, that can't be true. It is, I said flatly. I had Steve dig into him, and that's what he found. You weren't the only one, Julie. You were just another name on his list. She stared at me, stunned, as the realization began to sink in. I didn't know, she whispered, her voice breaking. I thought he cared about me. Well, he didn't, I snapped, the anger rising in my chest. He played you, Julie. He played you, and now we're both paying the price. Tears streamed down her face as she sat down at the table across from me. I'm so sorry, Tom. I was so stupid. I let myself believe that he was something he wasn't, and I destroyed everything we had because of it. For a moment, we were both silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her how much she had hurt me, but instead, I just felt tired. Tired of the fighting, tired of the pain, tired of everything. Maybe counseling isn't a bad idea, I finally said, my voice softer now. But it's going to take a long time to fix this, Julie. If it's even possible. She nodded, wiping her eyes. I'll do whatever it takes. I don't want to lose you, Tom. I love you, and I know I've hurt you, but I want to make things right. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure if I believed her, but for the first time in days, I felt a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could find a way through this. The next morning, we made our first appointment with a marriage counselor. Dr. Stein was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with a sharp gaze that seemed to see through every lie, every defense. As soon as we sat down in her office, I could feel the tension building between Julie and me. It was as though we were standing on opposite sides of a canyon, unsure how to reach each other. Let's start with why you're here, Dr. Stein said, her voice calm but firm. Julie glanced at me nervously before speaking. We've been going through a rough time. I made some mistakes, and now we're trying to figure out if we can fix things. I remained silent, not wanting to be the first to air our dirty laundry. Dr. Stein looked at me expectantly. Tom, what do you think? I don't know if we can fix this, I said honestly. She kissed another man. She betrayed me, and I don't know if I can ever trust her again. Dr. Stein nodded, jotting something down on her notepad. Julie, why did you kiss this other man? Julie looked down at her lap, her voice barely a whisper. I was confused. I felt lost after the kids left for college, and Brian was there. He made me feel seen, like I wasn't invisible. But it was a mistake. I know that now. Dr. Stein's gaze shifted back to me. Tom, how did that betrayal make you feel? I laughed bitterly. How do you think it made me feel? I felt like everything I believed in was a lie, like I wasn't enough for her. The room fell silent, the tension thick in the air. Dr. Stein took a deep breath and leaned forward. Trust is fragile, but it can be rebuilt. It's not easy, and it takes time, but it is possible. The question is, are both of you willing to put in the effort? Julie nodded quickly, her eyes pleading. I am. I'll do whatever it takes. I hesitated before answering. I don't know, I admitted. I want to try, but I don't know if I can ever get past this. Dr. Stein nodded, her expression understanding. That's fair, Tom. Trust isn't something that comes back overnight. But if you're willing to try, we can work on it together. And so, we began the long, painful process of trying to rebuild our marriage. Twice a week, we sat in Dr. Stein's office, unpacking every hurt, every resentment, every regret. There were days when I wanted to walk away, days when the pain felt too heavy to carry. But then there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where I saw glimpses of the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. Moments when I thought, maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back. It wasn't easy. The nights were the hardest. Lying in bed alone, knowing Julie was just down the hall, I found myself replaying everything in my mind. The kiss, the lies, the betrayal, and then the haunting image of Brian, the man who had come between us. Even though I knew he wasn't worth my anger, I couldn't stop thinking about him. What kind of man preys on married women like that? What kind of man destroys families for sport? One night, as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let him win. I wasn't going to let him destroy my marriage. If Julie and I had any chance of fixing things, I needed to let go of my anger toward Brian. He wasn't worth it. The next morning, I told Julie about my decision. I don't want to talk about him anymore, I said. Brian doesn't matter. What matters is us. Julie looked at me, tears welling in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. I'm so sorry for everything. It was a start. A small step, but a step nonetheless. Weeks passed, and the counseling sessions slowly started to have an effect, though the progress was often slow and painful. Dr. Stein encouraged us to talk openly, to express our hurt and anger in a way that didn't lead to more resentment. Some days it felt like we were taking steps forward. Other days, like we were right back where we started. I had never realized how much of our relationship had been built on assumptions, on the idea that we both knew what the other was feeling without having to say it. That was one of the hardest lessons, recognizing that we had stopped truly communicating a long time ago. I still couldn't bring myself to fully trust Julie. Every time I looked at her, I wondered if she was thinking about Brian. Even though she swore it had ended, that she hadn't spoken to him since that night, the doubt was always there, gnawing at the back of my mind. It didn't help that I knew she had been so easily drawn into his orbit, willing to risk everything for a man who was nothing more than a predator. The fact that Brian had been playing her all along only made it worse, but strangely, it wasn't the knowledge of his deception that stayed with me. It was the image of Julie kissing him. That image had become my constant companion. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. Every time I touched her, I imagined her touching him. It was like a poison in my veins, a slow, toxic drip that I couldn't escape. One evening, after a particularly grueling session with Dr. Stein, Julie and I sat together in the living room. The air between us was heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. She had been trying to bridge the gap between us, to show me that she was still committed to our marriage, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to meet her halfway. Tom, she said softly, breaking the silence, do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me? I stared at her for a long moment, unsure of how to answer. I wanted to forgive her, I really did, but every time I tried, the anger surged back to the surface. I don't know, I said finally. I want to, but I don't know if I can. Her face fell, but she nodded, as if she had expected that answer. I understand. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm going to keep trying. I'm going to keep proving to you that I'm here, that I'm committed to us. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure what to say. She had said those words so many times over the past few weeks, but I didn't know if I believed them. It's not just about proving yourself, Julie. It's about trust. You broke my trust, And that's not something you can just fix with words. It's going to take time. I know, she whispered. I'll wait as long as it takes. We sat in silence for a while, the sound of the clock ticking on the wall filling the room. I could feel her eyes on me, waiting, hoping for some sign that I was ready to move forward. But I wasn't sure if I was. I didn't know if I ever would be. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon when I was out running errands. I had stopped at the hardware store to pick up a few things for the house, trying to keep myself busy. As I stood in line to pay, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Steve, the private investigator. Just thought you'd like to know, Brian's been fired from the firm. Word is, he got caught up in some inappropriate behavior with another woman. Looks like karma finally caught up with him. I stared at the message, a strange sense of satisfaction washing over me. Brian had been caught. He had finally faced the consequences of his actions. But the feeling of victory was fleeting. As much as I had hated him, as much as I had blamed him for what had happened, I knew that Brian wasn't the real problem. The real problem had always been between Julie and me. For the first time, I realized that I had been focusing all my anger on the wrong person. Brian was a snake, sure, but he hadn't forced Julie to kiss him. She had made that choice on her own. And as much as I wanted to believe that he was solely to blame for the destruction of our marriage, I knew that wasn't true. I paid for my items and headed back to the car, my mind racing. Could I really move on from this? Could I let go of the anger that had been consuming me for so long? I wasn't sure, but for the first time, I felt like it might be possible. If Brian was out of the picture, maybe, just maybe, I could start to see Julie in a different light. Maybe I could start to rebuild what had been broken. That evening, I told Julie about Steve's text. Her reaction was immediate. Relief flooded her face, and she let out a breath she had been holding for what seemed like weeks. "He's really gone?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Yeah," I said, watching her closely. "He's gone." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I never want to see him again. I never want to think about him again." For the first time in a long time, I believed her. There was something different about the way she said it this time, something final. And for the first time, I felt a small flicker of hope. "Maybe we can move on from this," I said, surprising myself with the words. "Maybe now that he's out of the picture, we can really start to heal." Julie looked at me, her eyes wide with hope. "You really think so?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think it's worth trying." She nodded, her tears spilling over. "I want that, Tom. I want to move on. I want to heal." We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of everything that had happened still heavy on our shoulders, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. The next few weeks were a strange mix of hope and uncertainty. Dr. Stein continued to push us in our sessions, forcing us to confront the underlying issues in our marriage that had led to Julie's betrayal. It wasn't easy. There were still moments when the anger would flare up, when I would find myself unable to look at her without seeing Brian's face. But there were also moments of connection, moments when it felt like we were starting to rebuild the foundation of our relationship. One evening, after a particularly intense session, Julie and I decided to take a walk together. It was something we hadn't done in a long time, just the two of us, walking side by side, talking about nothing in particular. The air was crisp, the leaves crunching beneath our feet as we wandered through the neighborhood. It felt good, almost normal. "I miss this," Julie said softly, glancing over at me. "Just being with you like this." "I miss it too," I admitted. "It feels like we've been strangers for so long." She nodded, her eyes filled with a sadness that matched my own. "I hate that I did this to us. I hate that I let things get so bad." "We both did," I said, surprising myself with the admission. "It wasn't just you, Julie. I wasn't paying attention either. I wasn't listening." She stopped walking and turned to face me, her eyes shining with tears. "But you didn't deserve what I did. You didn't deserve any of it." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in months, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. The woman who had stood by my side through thick and thin, who had been my partner, my confidant, my best friend. "No," I didn't, I said quietly, but I'm willing to try and get past it. If you are. Her face crumpled, and she threw her arms around me, sobbing into my chest. I'll do anything, Tom. I'll do anything to make this right. I held her tightly, feeling her body shake with emotion. For the first time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way through this. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt and pain. But for the first time, I felt like we were both in it together. A few months later, things were starting to feel different. We weren't completely healed, far from it, but there was a sense of normalcy returning to our lives. We had fallen into a new routine, one that included open communication, honesty, and the commitment to rebuilding the trust that had been shattered. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when the past would rear its ugly head, but we were learning to navigate those moments together. Julie had completely cut off contact with everyone at her old job, including Brian. She had found a new position at a smaller firm, one where she could start fresh, away from the memories of what had happened. It had been a difficult transition, but it had helped. We both needed a clean slate. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, Julie reached over and took my hand. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "For what?" I asked, glancing over at her. "For not giving up on us," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "For giving me a second chance." I squeezed her hand, feeling a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. "We're not done yet," I said, smiling slightly, "but we're getting there." She nodded, resting her head on my shoulder as we watched the sky turn shades of pink and orange. It wasn't perfect, and it would never be the same as it had been before, but for the first time in a long time, I believed that we had a future, and that was enough. A few weeks after our efforts to rebuild, Julie received a call from her former coworker, Lauren Klein. She wasn't just checking in. She had news. "Brian's being sued," Lauren said. "Several of us are taking him to court for emotional manipulation and damages." Julie's face tightened as she listened. When she hung up, she looked at me. "It's happening. Brian is finally facing justice." The trial was scheduled. We decided to attend it to see how the man who almost destroyed our marriage would be brought to justice. The day of the trial had finally arrived, and the courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as people took their seats. The case had garnered attention from local media, and the gallery was filled with curious onlookers, reporters, and a few individuals who had once worked with Brian. Julie and I were seated near the back, silently watching as the 5 women who had brought the lawsuit against Brian entered the room, their faces a mixture of anger and resolve. Each of them had suffered at his hands in different ways, and now, after months of preparation, they were finally going to have their voices heard. The 5 women were led by Emily Dawson, a sharp and determined lawyer with a reputation for taking on high-profile cases. She had been instrumental in organizing the lawsuit and bringing the women together. Their stories were different, but they shared a common thread. Brian had manipulated, deceived, and emotionally damaged each of them in a way that left scars far deeper than anyone could see. As the judge entered the room, everyone rose to their feet. Judge Maria Richardson, a seasoned figure known for her no-nonsense approach, took her seat at the bench. She glanced over at Brian, who sat at the defendant's table with his own lawyer, a man who looked uncomfortable, as if he knew that this case was already lost. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. "The case of Dawson and others versus Brian Patterson." The trial began with opening statements from both sides. Emily Dawson stood tall and confident as she addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here today because 5 women have come forward to seek justice for the pain, manipulation, and emotional harm caused by Brian Patterson," she began, her voice steady but impassioned. These women trusted him. They believed his lies, his promises, and his false kindness. And in return, he exploited their vulnerabilities, leaving them to suffer while he moved on to his next victim. Today, we will show you how this man systematically preyed on these women, using their emotions and their trust as weapons. And we will prove that they deserve compensation for the moral damages they endured. As she spoke, the 5 women sat quietly, their faces resolute. I recognized some of them from the office where Julie had worked: Lauren Klein, who had been involved with Brian for months; Jessica Wilson, who had been manipulated into leaving her husband; and others whose names I hadn't known before. But now, I would learn their stories in detail. When Emily finished her opening statement, Brian's lawyer, Adam Morton, stood to address the jury. His expression was serious, but there was a nervous energy in his movements, as if he knew the weight of what was about to unfold. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client, Brian Patterson, is not the man these women claim he is," Morton began, his tone cautious. "While mistakes may have been made, relationships are complex, and emotions can often cloud judgment. We ask that you consider all the facts before making a decision. Mr. Patterson did not act with malicious intent, and we believe that when all the evidence is presented, you will see that this case is about misunderstandings rather than intentional harm." The trial moved into the testimony phase, and one by one, the women took the stand to tell their stories. Lauren Klein, a marketing executive in her early 30s, was the first to testify. She had been one of Brian's closest colleagues at the firm and had initially seen him as a mentor. But over time, his attention had shifted from professional to personal, and soon she found herself in a relationship with him, one that she believed was genuine. "Brian made me believe that we were building something real," Lauren said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "He told me he cared about me, that he was thinking about leaving his wife for me. But every time I brought up the future, he would change the subject or make excuses. Eventually, I realized I was just another one of his conquests." Emily Dawson guided her through the testimony, highlighting the manipulation Brian had used to keep Lauren emotionally invested while never intending to make good on his promises. "He made me feel like I was the most important person in his life," Lauren continued. "But once he moved on to someone else, he dropped me without a second thought. The emotional toll it took on me was devastating." Next came Jessica Wilson, the woman who had left her husband after becoming entangled in an affair with Brian. Her story was perhaps the most heartbreaking, as she had been convinced that Brian was going to build a life with her, only to discover that he had never intended to leave his own wife. "I threw away everything for him," Jessica said, tears welling in her eyes as she recounted how her marriage had fallen apart. "I believed him when he said he loved me. I believed him when he said he couldn't stand his own marriage and wanted to be with me. But as soon as I filed for divorce, he disappeared. I was left with nothing. No husband, no relationship, no stability. I was completely alone." Her testimony was damning, and the jury sat in rapt attention as she described how Brian had manipulated her into leaving her family, only to abandon her when she needed him most. The other three women shared similar stories. Each had been drawn into Brian's web of lies, believing that they were special, that they meant something to him. But in the end, they had all been discarded, left to pick up the pieces of their lives while Brian moved on without a second thought. By the time all 5 women had testified, the courtroom was silent, the weight of their collective pain palpable. Emily Dawson stood to give her closing arguments. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard the stories of 5 brave women who were manipulated, lied to, and emotionally abused by Brian Patterson," she began, her voice calm but fierce. "These women trusted him. They believed his words, his promises, and his lies. And in return, they were left broken, their lives shattered by a man who saw them as nothing more than disposable objects. Today, we ask that you deliver justice for these women. We ask that you award them the compensation they deserve for the moral damages they suffered. And we ask that you send a message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated." The jury deliberated for several hours before returning with their verdict. When they finally filed back into the courtroom, the tension was thick in the air. The foreman stood, clearing his throat before speaking. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Brian Patterson, guilty of all charges," he announced, his voice clear and unwavering. There was a collective sigh of relief from the plaintiff's side of the courtroom. The women exchanged glances, their eyes filling with tears of vindication. Judge Richardson took over, her expression stern as she addressed Brian. "Mr. Patterson, it is clear that your actions caused significant harm to these women. You used manipulation and deceit to exploit their trust, and as a result, you are responsible for the damage they have suffered. This court hereby orders you to pay compensation to each of the 5 plaintiffs for the emotional and psychological harm you inflicted. She paused before continuing, her voice unwavering. The court awards Emily Klein $1.2 million for emotional distress and reputational damage. Jessica Wilson is awarded $2.5 million for the collapse of her marriage and the significant mental anguish she endured. Rachel Moore is awarded $1 million for the emotional manipulation and the professional consequences she suffered. Sarah Lawson is awarded $1.5 million for the emotional abuse she faced and the impact it had on her personal and professional life. Finally, Kelly Andrews is awarded $2 million for the emotional trauma and the financial instability caused by her relationship with you. The numbers were staggering, and Brian's face drained of color as the reality of his situation set in. He had been found guilty, and now he was responsible for paying nearly $8.2 million in total compensation to the women he had hurt. Brian's lawyer stood, looking defeated. "Your Honor, my client simply doesn't have the means to pay these amounts." Judge Richardson fixed him with a stern gaze. "Then he will liquidate his assets to do so. This court has made its decision, and it will be enforced." Brian's fate was sealed. He had lost everything: his career, his reputation, and now, financially, he was ruined. As the courtroom emptied, I caught a glimpse of him slumped over at his table, his face a mask of disbelief and defeat. It was the end of the line for him. Julie and I left the courtroom quietly, neither of us saying much. We hadn't come for revenge, but it was hard to deny the sense of satisfaction that came with seeing Brian finally face the consequences of his actions. Justice had been served, and the women who had suffered at his hands had been given the vindication they deserved.